Hello, my name is Arnie Breitbart. I'm a plastic surgeon by day and a vintner by night and weekend. Today, we're talking about everything wine, from growing grapes, making wine, Passover wine suggestions, and tasting wine. And we're doing this event for the merit of a refuah shlema for Chana Esther Bat Ayala Hadar. So in talking about wine, the first thing we're going to talk about is kosher wine. What makes a kosher wine? Well, there's kind of two main things. One, all the ingredients in the wine, must be kosher. And you can make a wine just from grapes as the only ingredient, because there's indigenous yeast that will ferment the grapes and turn into wine. So if you crush a grape, God will reward you with a nice wine, usually. But when wine is made, often there are other additives added. Sometimes, instead of using indigenous yeast, extra yeast is added, and obviously that needs to be kosher certified, and there are many yeasts out there that are kosher certified. There are other additives that have been used historically in making wines, like, for example, there are fining agents to make reduce the cloudy appearance of wines. In the past, some things like ox blood have been used, and obviously that wouldn't be kosher. So the first thing is all the ingredients in the wine, besides the grapes, need to be kosher. The other thing is, from the crush of the grape to the bottling of the wine, it can only be handled by someone who's Shomer Shabbat. And the reason for that, well, historically, wines have been used in pagan ceremonies, from, ancient times. And this was a way for, the rabbis to prevent Jews from mingling with the pagans in their ceremonies. And that was done by requiring, again, from the crush to the bottling, that the wine can only be handled by someone who's Shomer Shabbat. So that discouraged a Jew from partaking in these pagan ceremonies where wine was often used. The other issue kind of with wines that also comes up is the concept of mivushal. And that was another safeguard to prevent Jews from mingling with the pagans in their ceremonies. And a mivushal wine is basically a wine that has been heated or boiled. And the logic behind this is that a mivushal wine that's been boiled would not be appealing to the pagan. They would consider that an inferior wine and would not use that in their ceremony. So a wine that's mivushal can be poured, for example, by a non-Jew, to a Jew who's drinking it. But again, a pagan who 2,000 years ago in their ceremony would not, for example, take a kosher wine, use it in their ceremony and give it back to the Jew, because the Jew would not accept it because it was, handled by the pagan. A non-mevushal wine, which a lot are made today, because today in mevushal, it's not a boiling, but it's a flash pasteurization process, which is very kind of rapid heating. And it's today, it's done in a way that generally does not affect the quality of the wine. So there are many top quality mevushal kosher wines, out there, but some wine purists consider even that brief flash pasteurization to affect the quality of the wine. So most of the higher end kosher wines are non-mevushal, which therefore means technically they can't be poured by a non-Jew to a Jew, for example. Now moving along, about 15 years ago, I had this Tanakhic vision to start a vineyard. Much to my wife's chagrin, I dug up the only kind of vacant spot on our property. I got trellis material, stakes, and got some vines, dug up our yard, and started to plant a vineyard. My wife thought I was crazy, but a few years later, we had this. A vineyard, kind of sprouted in our yard, and that looked very nice. It takes a few years for grapes to grow, about 3 years or so. About 3 years later, we had this, which was also, a pleasant surprise. And I figured now that I have grapes, I should learn how to make wine. So I got some books and learned how to make wine. Now, a vineyard is a very, kind of special, beautiful place. In the life of a grape, basically, the vineyard has lots of kind of shoots and vines, and in the life of a grape, the vines are sort of pruned down, before the growing season, and you just have some, kind of a few bare vines. So as the growing season starts, usually around April, buds start to grow and leaves start to form, kind of like this. And then, by around June or so, small flowers are forming, and each of these flowers will become a grape. And then later in the summer, the grapes start to ripen. Now, a white grape, such as a Chardonnay like this, ripens by, the grapes are kind of turned translucent. Similarly, with the Sauvignon Blanc, another grape that I grow in my yard, similarly turns kind of this, translucent, kind of yellowish color. The red grape, something, very special happens. There's a term called vieillissement, a French term that refers to the ripening of the red grape. Now, red grapes start out white and then they turn, red during the ripening phase, over the summer. And it's a very, kind of magical, happening. And it's really kind of quite beautiful, to see that. And from that, they go to this, which is a, ripe Cabernet Sauvignon grape in my yard. And to this, which is a ripe Merlot grape in my yard. Now there's a term called terroir, which is another kind of French term, which refers to basically the geography and climate of a vineyard. And when planning to plant a vineyard, most, grape growers are very kind of choosy and picky about picking the, perfect terroir. So certain places in the world, such as Bordeaux and Napa, Golan, have, excellent terroirs. And it's a combination of factors, including, the climate, the elevation, whether it's near a river or an ocean, the quality of the soil. And there are, optimal terroirs for growing kind of certain types of grapes. It's kind of, very important. And that's why certain grape regions of the world, grow, grapes that make the best wines. Now, when I was kind of planting my vineyard, I had one spot in my yard. So this was my terroir. So I figured this is all I've got. So I couldn't choose the terroir, it chose me. But I planted my vineyard and lo and behold, it grew and made, nice grapes that made nice wine. Now the harvest time is a very exciting time in the vineyard, and we like to get everybody involved. So harvest time is usually in our vineyard, which is called Chateau Marcel, named after my daughter. Thought it had a nice sound to it. Chateau Marcel, we usually harvest at the end of September. Sometimes could be a little earlier, a little later. And this is Chardonnay grapes that we harvested last year. Now, harvest time, like I said, is a very special time. And if you ever walk through a vineyard during harvest time, and you should, it's a really beautiful experience. It's this like sweet, luscious smell of the grapes, this intoxicating smell that's kind of, like, the Garden of Eden. So I can imagine in Gan Eden, there was, such a scent of ripening fruit. And my grandfather had an expression, Tom Fin Gan Eden, the taste of Gan Eden. And this is what a vineyard at harvest time is like, with this, beautiful, sweet smell of the grapes. So this is, our kind of recent harvest. Let me just go back for a second. Harvest time.
Sauvignon, no?
Sauvignon Blanc.
Beautiful. And that's Chardonnay.
So that was our last harvest. And last harvest, my grandson got involved in the harvest too. He picked the first grapes and he squeezed them with his hand. So that was a lot of fun. And this is some of our harvests from last year with Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Merlot, and Cabernet. Now, after the grapes are harvested in making wine, you crush the grapes right away, and the crush is basically to just break the skins. You're not squeezing the juice out; you're just kind of breaking the skins. And one way to do this is by stomping on the grapes, and I used to do that before I got this machine. But stomping on the grapes is really also quite a a lovely experience. And if you haven't done it, a la I Love Lucy, you should try it one day. It's this sensuous, cool feeling of the grapes, squishing, under your feet. Obviously, you wash your feet, but it's a very pleasant experience. But it's not so practical because in making wine, you want to get the stems off the grape, separate the grapes from the stems. So you'll have to do that kind of by hand. But I upgraded and got this machine that, throw the grapes in. And, this is how it works. The grapes are
Chardonnay crush.
So the grapes are put into that kind of hopper. It's and the machine basically crushes the grape, separates the stem, and you end up with a combination of skins and juice. And grapes it's the sweetest fruit. It's about 25% sugar, and even that grape juice is delicious. The best grape juice you've ever had. And in harvest time, you need to harvest at just the right moment. So, just before around harvest time, I'm in the vineyard testing the sugar content of the grapes. I use this instrument called a refractometer. I squeeze a grape, put the juice on, I kind of look at it, and it tells me the percentage of sugar. So that's very important in doing the harvest, as well as the acidity of the grape. So that's something I also test during the harvest. So it's kind of a very critical decision exactly when to harvest, getting the optimal balance of sugar and acid. And because all the sugar is converted to alcohol, you need to start with a proper sugar content of the grape. This is crushed red grapes coming out. Now, after the crush, then you're making wine. Red grapes are handled differently than white grapes. So to make red wine, if you're going to add yeast, like I do, you do it within the first couple days. You add the yeast to this basically mixture of juice and skins, the fresh crush. If you're going to use indigenous yeast, you just kind of let it sit, and the indigenous yeast that's in the vineyard on the grapes kind of takes over. But if you have a vineyard where the indigenous yeasts are not quite as predictable, you can opt for a commercial yeast, as I do. So this is pouring the yeast in, and the yeast starts the fermentation process, and this is what fermentation looks like. So in fermentation, the sugar in the grape is converted to alcohol, and carbon dioxide is a byproduct. So the bubbles are carbon dioxide. And I do this in my basement, and during fermentation time, the whole house smells like fermentation, which is also quite a nice smell if you like fermentation. So those are steps in making red wine, and then the fermentation takes place over a period of a couple of weeks. And after the fermentation is mostly completed, at that point you're squeezing the juice out. So you're separating the juice, which is now kind of new wine, from the skins. And I use this machine called a ratchet press. It does that. So you can see the grapes are being squeezed and the wine is coming out. And then after that's done, you're left with this, which is basically, it's called a pumice cake. You're left with, basically the skins and the seeds, and you separated the wine. And from that point on, the wine is aging. And it's for red wine, the aging process is, generally 1 to 2 years. And during that time, the wine develops a complexity. It's the aging process is another great French word called élevage, where the wine is being elevated. It attains a complexity and flavor and structure. And during that period, there's sediment that's forming, and there's kind of racking of the wine off the sediment. That's done a few times. The aging can be done in barrels, or it can be done in glass containers. And that kind of continues until the wine is ready to bottle. Now a white wine and rosé is handled differently. So a white wine, basically right after the crush, instead of fermenting with the skins, the fermentation is done after the wine is pressed. So you squeeze out the juice, you separate it from the skins, and you take that juice, and now you're adding yeast to that juice. So with a red wine, the red color of the wine is basically imparted by the skins. And during the fermentation process, that the skin color basically is going into the wine, and that makes this intense color of the wine. Now for a white wine, the skins don't add too much in terms of character to the wine. Some grapes are the exception, like Chardonnay, which can benefit from some skin contact. But in general, with white wines, the juice is pressed off the skins, even the first day, and then yeast is soon added. And this is fermentation of a white wine, where you can see those bubbles. Now rosé is handled like a white wine, which is basically a red grape treated like a white wine. So after the crush of the red grape, there's a brief skin contact. So within a few hours or a few days, the wine the juice is pressed off the skin. So there's just a little color from the skins, and that gives a rosé, just a kind of a tinge of red color, which can range from, pink or salmon, kind of light or dark, depending on the grape and the contact, time on the skins. But basically, you take this, pressed red grape juice and add the yeast to it, and then it's handled like a white wine. Now, unlike red wines, which generally benefit from at least 1 to 2 years of aging, white wines and rosés, generally can age just 6 to 12 months. Some wines like a Chardonnay can benefit from longer aging, but again, after the aging process, then the wine is bottled, corked. There's a kind of a corker, instrument that puts the cork in the bottle, and then kind of the capsules and labels are put on. Now, I've made many types of wine over the last 10 years or so. And for those people out there who don't know, I'm a Bruce Springsteen fanatic. And over the years, I've made wines to commemorate all of his albums, whites, reds, rosés, sparkling wines. Sparkling wines are kind of interesting because it's basically taking a finished wine and then adding yeast and sugar back into the bottle. So the fermentation happens again in the bottle, but now the CO2 is being trapped inside the bottle, and that makes the bubbles. And there's a process to kind of get the yeast out. But I made many Springsteen album wines that I have, lyrics on the back, as well as all those, pompous things that, wine makers put on the bottle to describe the wines. Now, some people have asked me, have you given any of this wine to Bruce Springsteen? And the answer is sort of. I have a friend whose brother works with somebody whose brother-in-law did some landscaping for Bruce Springsteen. So I got some wine to him through this person, and apparently got to his house. But even more directly, when Bruce Springsteen had his Broadway show, as a Springsteen fanatic, I attended those. But I also went before the show started, as him and his wife were entering. His wife is also a performer, and she was in the Broadway show performing with him. She's a musician, has albums of her own. So I handed her a bottle of her wine and his wine as she was walking in, and she loved it. And she ended up posting on her Instagram page, during the concert, in the dressing room, she staged that. And when she walked out, I said, "I hope you like the wine." She said, "Yeah, I'm taking it home." So I think it got to his house. Whether he drank it, I don't know. If I was a celebrity and some stranger hands me a bottle of wine, I don't know if I drink it, but I'm an honest guy, and I make good wine that's not poison. But he may not know that. But if he ever wants to invite me over to have the wine, I'm up for that. What we're going to be tasting wine later. So a wine we're going to taste is this, Yardane Cabernet. If you have a wine, or this wine, or any wine to taste, you can open that bottle now. We'll let it, breathe. If you don't have a wine, that's okay also. But I have this. There's this nifty corkscrew called the Rabbit, which basically works by you kind of sort of depress the plunger, pull it out. It pops out the cork, and then you kind of do that, and it kind of expels the cork. So we have this wine, and we're going to put it to the side. We'll let it breathe, because that's what wine connoisseurs do. But some of the wines that I've made, like I said, here's one of my Springsteen wines, and I put lyrics on, and I put all those pompous things describing the wine that winemakers do. So this one, for example, show a little faith, there's magic in the night, made with choice Cabernet Sauvignon grapes from our own vineyard. This wine is deftly balanced with pure, ripe currant, plum, and blackberry fruit, ending with a burst of espresso, raspberry, and spice flavors. Yeah, well, maybe. I think I tasted that. A wine connoisseur probably tasted better than, I might, but why not? I have fun with the labels. Because tramps like us, baby, we were born to run. So that's a Cabernet. For Springsteen's latest album, Letter to You, In my letter to you, I took all my fears and doubts. In my letter to you, all the hard things I found out. In my letter to you, all that I found true. And I sent it in my letter to you. Made with our own lovingly grown Chardonnay grapes, this wine is complex and exotic, offering flavors of fig, apricot, and melon, with notes of guava and mango. Guava and mango, maybe. That's sort of detected in Chardonnay grapes. It's your ghost moving through the night, spirit filled with light. I need you by my side. Your love and I'm alive. And I also made that wine into a sparkling wine. This is a sparkling Chardonnay, also known as a Blanc de Blancs. Here's a Moscato I made of Born in the USA. And then I took that Moscato and I made into a sparkling Moscato d'Asti to celebrate his live 1975 to 1985 album. Now in America, particularly Napa, most wines are sold by the grape variety, like you get a Cabernet, for example. In other parts of the world, like Bordeaux, they're not kind of labeled by the type of grape, they're labeled by the region. So a Bordeaux classically is a blend of grapes. It's often a blend of, primarily Cabernet or Merlot, depending on which part of Bordeaux it's in, as well as blending other grapes like Malbec and Cabernet Franc. So, I made a Bordeaux style, wine commemorating Springsteen's Broadway show that has Cabernet, Malbec, Sauvignon Blanc, and Cabernet Franc. Now, I've also made wines commemorating some of my, favorite artists. These are some Vermeer wines that I've made. I've also made wines commemorating another of my favorite artists, Klimt. Here's some of my Klimt wines. And, a wine commemorating a Baudin, another artist. And this is a rosé. What's interesting about this one, during the, some of the major acids in wine include tartaric acid. And sometimes tartaric acid can precipitate out of the wine either during the aging process or even in the bottle. And here's tartaric acid crystals, which aren't dangerous. They have no taste actually, but they're called wine diamonds. So if you want to impress somebody, if you see little crystals in the wine, you can call them wine diamonds. Wine also, besides alcoholic fermentation, wines also undergo something called malolactic fermentation, which is another acid in the wine is malic acid, and it has sort of a kind of a harsh mouth feel. And there's a bacteria that's also indigenous, in the winery, in the used barrel that converts the malic acid into lactic acid, which is kind of a softer mouth feel that has, even a buttery kind of feel. So if somebody describes a Chardonnay as buttery, it's because it's undergoing a malolactic fermentation. So if you want to impress your friends, when you're drinking Chardonnay, you can say this has a buttery feel. It must have had a malolactic fermentation. I recently made to a Purim wine, and this is Rembrandt's The Triumph of Mordecai. Now I'm gonna talk about some wines and wine suggestions for Passover. Now, if you want to have 4 cups of Manischewitz, that's fine. If you enjoy that, that's great. And I enjoyed Manischewitz at the seders of my Uncle Leibushin and Basha, over 50 years ago. And Manischewitz wine is a sweet wine, obviously, And the history of Manischewitz is in the 1800s, Jewish immigrants started coming from Eastern Europe. Obviously they needed, wine for their, kiddushes and seders. And you couldn't just go to the liquor store and get a kosher wine. So they had to find ways to make wine. And the Concord grape is kind of the Native American grape, especially in New York. and Concord grape, makes a nice Welch's grape juice and grape jelly and a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So they figured, let's make Concord grapes into wine. But as it turns out, Concord grapes don't make a very good wine. It made a wine that had what's called a foxy, kind of flavor, sort of a musty type flavor, and was made palatable by sweetening it, with sugar. So thus the sweet Manischewitz, Concord grape wines. And if you enjoy that, that's fine. But if you want to be a little bolder, I suggest trying some of the, very excellent wines that are out there. And these days, there are many superb wines, made in Israel, in the United States, in Europe, that you can, find in many, kind of wine stores and online. So may I suggest for the Passover Seder, for each of the 4 cups, to have a red wine, a white wine, a rosé, a sparkling wine, or a dessert wine. And I can, we'll talk about some of those. So, this is sort of a premium wine, Covenant, which is from Napa, which is an interesting story. There's a fellow, Jeff Morgan, who was a wine and food, writer and editor. And in the early 2000s, he decided to, start a winery. He was in Napa, and he wanted to make the best kosher wine, ever made. And he figured, like, I can get the best quality grapes in Napa, have a very good winemaker, and I'll make a great kosher wine. And he largely succeeded, with his Covenant Cabernet. He makes, other wines too. He subsequently, a few years ago, his daughter made Aliyah, and he opened a Covenant Israel, winery as well. So it's, one of the kind of top, kosher wineries out there. Yatir is another, high quality Israeli wine from the Yatir forest in the Judean Hills. This is a blend of Shiraz, Merlot, and Cabernet, and they consistently make kind of top quality wines. Now this is kind of, moving on to, white wines. This is one of my favorite vineyards. It's Castel, Domaine du Castel, and they make, a great red wine, Grand Vin du Castel. And this winery was started by a fellow, Eli Ben-Zaken, who was born in Alexandria, Egypt, moved to Europe in the 70s, made Aliyah. And he has the restaurant Mamma Mia in Jerusalem, which, some of you may know of. I remember going there in the 80s even. But in the late 80s, he had this idea to start a vineyard. He knew wine somewhat, but he started this vineyard in Ramat Raziel outside of Jerusalem, and made superb wines that were very kind of highly regarded. His Grand Vin du Castel, red wine is sort of his flagship wine. There's a Petit Castel red wine, and this Blanc du Castel, the white wine, is consistently recognized as one of the top, white wines in Israel. So this is a great wine, from a great winery that's now in Yad Hashmona. Covenant, makes, nice white wines too, as does, the Golan Heights Winery. And kind of just moving back for a second, the Golan Heights Winery, we're going to be tasting this one, kind of later. This is the Yardain Cabernet Sauvignon. And the Golan Heights Winery is interesting. As you know, Israel had a great history of winemaking, dating from, even before King David. And at the time King David, Israeli wines were coveted, even by the pharaohs. But after the destruction of the Second Temple, winemaking, kind of ceased to exist in Israel. And in the 1800s, Rothschild and Montefiore brought back, the wine industry of Israel. Rothschild, imported vines from France. the wineries are started in Jerusalem, and some wineries are started in the Carmel area, and some of these wineries ultimately became the Carmel winery. But for much of the 20th century, most of the wines were just used for sacramental purposes, not considered high, top quality wines. But in the 1970s, a professor of viticulture from UC Davis, California, which is one of the top wine schools, visited Israel, went to the Golan Heights, and said, "This is like a perfect terroir." So the Israeli high-quality wine industry was pretty much born around then, and the Golan Heights winery soon opened. Vines were planted in the late 70s. Started making wines in the early 80s. So Golan Heights Winery is one of the top, wineries in Israel. Now, so we covered kind of red, whites, and now, talking rosés. Like I said, rosé is from a red grape, but it's sort of handled as a white wine almost, where the juice is kind of pressed off the skins kind of very early, within, even a day or two, to just get some skin color. This Castel is actually kind of a blend, and this wine, like I said, Castel makes a great, red and white. They also make a great rosé. So this is a Castel rosé. Makes nice rosés also. Wineries in France making kosher wines. This is a Rothschild rosé. Now in France, in Provence, for example, the classic rosé is made from Grenache grape, but you can make a rosé, out of any grape, really, any red grape. To sparkling wines and champagne. This is a Drapier champagne. Now, to be a champagne, it has to be produced in the Champagne region of France. And typically it's a blend of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. But to be a champagne, it has to be produced in the Champagne region of France. If it's not from the Champagne region of France, and you make a wine from the same grapes, you have to call it a sparkling wine. You can't call it a champagne. And this is a Hagafen, which also makes great wines. It's a kosher vineyard and winery in Napa. And if you, go to Napa and you want to visit a kosher, vineyard and winery and do tastings, this is the one to go to in Napa. And they've been making wines, since, late 70s, early 80s, a great winery. And sweet wines are kind of interesting. Now, to make a sweet wine, you generally don't add sugar to it, but you start with a very high sugar content grape. Now, how can you do that? You can do that a couple ways. You harvest very late. So where you're pushing the sugar content of the grape up. So when you ferment that wine, all the sugar can't ferment, turn to alcohol. So you're left with some residual sugar, and that makes a sweet wine. So Castel makes a M. du Castel, which is a late harvest Moscato. Hagafen makes a late harvest Chenin Blanc, sweet wine. In France, in the Sauternes region, there's wines that are made, including kosher wines, that near harvest time, the grapes are infected with a fungus called botrytis, also called noble rot, which is not a bad fungus. It doesn't kind of spoil the grapes, so to speak, as some funguses can, and ruin the crop, but it kind of dehydrates the grape and kind of concentrates, the sugar. So in turn, making a sweeter wine. And there's also something called ice wine, which is wines that are, produced in kind of colder climates like Austria, Canada, which are also grapes that are been left on the vine, for a long time, getting into the, frost season, where the grapes are, almost kind of frozen, and they're also kind of more concentrated in making a sweeter wine. So those are some Passover wine suggestions. Now we'll go into tasting wine, and I'll teach you how to taste wine like a pro, so you can impress your family and friends at Shabbat dinner, at the Seder table, or in a restaurant. So we're gonna, take our wine. So if you have the Yardain wine, fine. If you have any red wine, fine. If you have any wine at all, fine. And if you don't have a wine, that's fine at all. And you can just pay attention, and next time you have one. So we're gonna kind of, pour that a little bit. Now, the first thing you do, we're gonna look at the color. So that's one thing you judge. So best way to look at the color is put it down against a white background. Not to put it up to light, it kind of distorts it, but you put it down against a white background. And as a Cabernet, it has the classic, violet appearance. It's the skins have an intense color. It's basically kind of a thick skin with a lot of color in it. So it imparts the color to the wine, makes it this violet color. Other grapes like a Pinot Noir is, impart less color. So it's more like a ruby color. So that's the first thing you look at, the color. The other thing is viscosity. A sweeter wine would be more viscous. This is a dry wine that's, not so viscous. Now we're going to swirl it. Now, having a classic wine glass like this, besides like kind of looking nice and cool, and you think like you're a professional, it actually helps to make the kind of aromas more pronounced, in kind of swishing it around. So we're going to kind of swish it like that, and this is kind of releasing the aromas. As the alcohol evaporates, you kind of, you're smelling these aromas. But something to look for when you kind of swish it around, you can see, kind of like these drips, forming along the edges of the glass. And these are called legs. So if you want to impress your friends as you're doing this, you say, "Nice legs." So those are kind of the legs of the wine. So now we're going to smell the wine, and this is one of my favorite parts. So you kind of give it a good, kind of twirl, and you stick your nose in it, and take a big whiff, and kind of don't be shy, and get your nose in it, take a big whiff, and what do you smell? Some people may say, smells nice, smells like wine. If you have a good nose that you've kind of developed, sort of educated your nose to detect, scents. You may smell blackberry, plum, currant. So those are kind of classic smells, and tastes, found in a full-bodied, red wine like a Cabernet. Those. So these, like a Pinot Noir, for example, has more of the red fruits, like cherry and strawberry and raspberry. Now, obviously, those fruits are not added to the wine. That's, the grape kind of has that, flavor and smell profile. So you can, if you're, and you can kind of train your nose by drinking a lot of wine or smelling a lot of wine. And these sommeliers that taste lots of wines kind of do that by smelling and tasting a lot of fruits and other things and wines. So that's the smell. Now we're going to move on to the taste. Now, when you taste a wine, just pay attention to a few things. One, when you put it in your mouth, and you swish it all around, because you want other taste buds all over your mouth, on your tongue, on your palate, on the side of the mouth, by your throat even. So you want to kind of swish it all around and expose all those surfaces to the wine to activate all your taste buds. And then you, and as you're doing that, you think about what you're tasting. And you can also on the side of your mouth, you can kind of feel sort of a tartness, and that sort of reflects the acidity of the wine. And then when you drink it, in your throat, you kind of feel sort of a heat, so to speak, which reflects the alcohol content. And this one is 14.5%, which is, sort of an average Cabernet. Most Cabernets are in the 14 to 15% range, which is a relatively high alcohol content. A Chardonnay is generally in the 13 to 14% range. Some other whites, could be also like in the 12 to 13%, range or a little higher. But in general, a wine should be at least in the 12 to 15%, range, because you need the right alcohol content to kind of make a stable wine. So anyway, so we're gonna kind of taste it. So you put in there. Swallow it, and you can then kind of breathe, in from your mouth and then out through your nose. And, that again exposes kind of these surfaces in your olfactory bulb, to these, smells. And because smell and taste is sort of interrelated, it kind of affects, how you're tasting the wine. So what do you taste? Again, some people may say, tastes like wine, tastes nice. But hard to describe it. But the people that know how to describe it, or think they do, or they're faking it, describe this as again a black fruit characteristic. So first is sort of kind of how the fruit is being expressed. So again, the classic Cabernet is the black fruit profile, like the blackberry and the plum and the currant. And again, if you want to get fancy, you say tastes like blackberry jam, or if you want to get really fancy, you say tastes like wild blackberry jam. So that's sort of kind of fruity things that you may taste. Now in a Pinot Noir, again, you may taste the cherry, strawberry, raspberry. In a Chardonnay, you're tasting things like peach and melon, and guava, mango, perhaps. In a Sauvignon Blanc, you may taste kind of citrusy type flavors. You may taste, lime and orange, and you could also taste things like pear, and again, if you want to get fancy, you're tasting Asian pear. But people get carried away with this, and again, some people have better palates and noses than others, and can taste and smell these things. But like anything, you can kind of train your senses for these things and be a better taster. Now, you can also taste, like, there are herbaceous notes. Like this one, for example, has been described as, there's, smells of ginger, or taste of anise, or thyme, or mint tea. So there's like these herbaceous notes that you can, taste too. Some people taste things like grass, and again, if you want to get really kind of wild, you're tasting wild grass, or if you really want to get crazy, you're tasting fresh cut, Kentucky bluegrass. So the pros kind of get very carried away with this, and maybe they're tasting and smelling it, maybe they're not, maybe they're embellishing it, but actually all these flavors and tastes also are attributed to certain actual chemicals in the wine. So it's not kind of completely made up. Other things, characteristics of wine, there's, wines, like a red wine is classically aged in oak, and some white wines like a Chardonnay classically are too. So you can taste those hints of oak in the wine. And some people, will say, I detect an oakiness, and oak is also described as vanilla. So again, if you want to impress your friends, you say, I taste some vanilla in here. And if you really want to impress them, like nutmeg is in this oak vanilla kind of spectrum. So you can say, I taste a hint of nutmeg, and that's what really like, whoa, that's kind of impressive. There are other things that are kind of reflected in the wine during the aging process. It kind of changes the character of wine, so it kind of brings out these earthy flavors, like kind of a leather or a flint. And again, some people get really carried away with the flavors. Like it may taste like a wet T-shirt or tar. There's all these kind of crazy flavors that are kind of detectable in some wines. So you can, but it's okay just to say tastes good. I like it. I'll get it again. Or to and if you kind of train yourself, maybe you'll taste these things. But if you can, fine. If you can't, that's fine also. So that's our tasting, for today, and hope you enjoyed it, and have a nice Passover. And thanks for watching.